Ever wondered what it was really like when a Viking king died? Forget everything you've seen in movies about peaceful burials with golden treasures. The truth is far more disturbing than Hollywood could ever show you. We're talking about an era when human beings were treated like disposable property. And death wasn't just the end for one person, it was the beginning of a nightmare for others. Picture this. It's the 11th century. Somewhere along the cold shores of Scandinavia, a powerful Viking chieftain has just breathed his last breath. But instead of mourning ending with the burial, it's only just begun. Because in Viking society, dying alone was for peasants. The wealthy and powerful, they took company with them to the afterlife. And that company didn't volunteer. What I'm about to tell you isn't some dark fantasy or exaggerated legend. This is documented history, witnessed by diplomats, recorded in sagas, and proven by modern archaeology. Viking kings and chieftains were literally buried with living human beings, slaves, who were killed specifically to serve their masters in death. And the methods used to select and sacrifice these people would shock you to your core. Recent archaeological discoveries have shattered our romanticized view of Viking culture. Scientists analyzing burial sites across Norway, Sweden, and Denmark have uncovered evidence so disturbing that it's forced us to completely rewrite what we thought we knew about these ancient warriors. They weren't just raiders and explorers, they were slavers on a massive scale, and their burial practices reveal just how brutal their society really was. Here's what makes this even more chilling. We have eyewitness accounts. In 922 CE, an Arab diplomat named Ahmad ibn Fadlan traveled along the Volga River and witnessed these burial ceremonies firsthand. His detailed descriptions read like something from a horror movie, except every word was real. He watched as slave girls were selected for death, prepared over several days, and then killed in ways that would make your stomach turn. But this wasn't random violence. This was organized, ritualized murder that required community participation and careful planning. The Vikings had turned human sacrifice into a sophisticated religious ceremony, complete with specific roles for different participants and elaborate preparations that could last for days. What we're looking at isn't just individual cruelty, it's systematic dehumanization on a scale that rivals the worst atrocities in human history. Archaeological evidence from sites like Flakstad in Norway tells an even darker story. When scientists analyzed the remains of people buried together, they made a horrifying discovery. The individuals buried with their heads intact had eaten diets rich in meat and dairy, the food of free people. But the decapitated bodies, they showed signs of fish-based diets, the mark of slaves. Even in death, you could tell who was property and who was owner based on what they'd been allowed to eat while alive. The most disturbing part? This wasn't happening in some dark corner of Viking society. This was mainstream. Estimates suggest that slaves made up as much as 10% of the entire Scandinavian population during the Viking Age. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of people living in bondage, knowing that their lives could be ended at any moment to satisfy their master's spiritual needs. And here's where it gets really twisted. The Vikings didn't just grab random slaves for these sacrifices. They had selection processes. Ibn Fadlan's account describes how a dead chieftain's family would ask his slave women and boys a simple question: which of you wishes to die with him? Usually, it was a young slave girl who would volunteer, though volunteer is a generous term when refusal meant a lifetime of even worse treatment. From the moment she agreed, that girl's fate was sealed. She'd be put under constant supervision, given alcohol to drink, and encouraged to sing and celebrate as if she were preparing for a wedding instead of her own execution. The psychological manipulation was as sophisticated as it was cruel. They made her complicit in her own murder by framing it as an honor rather than a death sentence. Modern forensic analysis of slave graves reveals the brutal reality of their final moments. These people didn't die peacefully. They show signs of restraints, violent injuries, and execution-style deaths. Many were decapitated, others strangled, some beaten to death. The evidence suggests they fought to live right up until the end, despite the ceremonial facade that surrounded their murders. But why did the Vikings do this? What drove them to treat human beings as disposable grave goods? The answer lies in their worldview about death and the afterlife. Vikings believed that the next world was a mirror of this one, complete with social hierarchies and the need for servants. A king who died without his retinue would arrive in the afterlife as a commoner. That was unthinkable for people who'd built their entire identities around power and status. The scale of Viking slaving operations was staggering. They didn't just capture the occasional prisoner during raids, they built entire economic systems around human trafficking. Trading centers like Dublin, Birka, and Hedeby became massive slave markets where human beings were bought and sold like cattle. Archaeological excavations at these sites have uncovered iron collars, shackles, and restraints designed specifically for controlling human cargo. Here's what's particularly chilling. Many of the slaves sacrificed in these burials weren't even foreign captives. Strontium isotope analysis of their bones reveals that some had grown up in the same regions as their masters. These were local people, born into slavery, who spent their entire lives knowing they were property. Some were the children of earlier slaves, inheriting their bondage like a genetic curse. The Vikings had turned slavery into a hereditary system that trapped entire bloodlines in bondage. A slave woman's children became slaves automatically. Their children's children would be slaves. Generation after generation lived and died as property, with no hope of freedom except through the twisted mercy of being selected for sacrifice. The ceremonial aspects of these sacrifices reveal just how deeply embedded this practice was in Viking culture. This wasn't something done in secret or hidden from society. These were public events that required community participation. Multiple people had specific roles in the killing process. Some held the victim down, others performed the actual murder, while community members beat drums to drown out the screams. Ibn Fadlan's account describes a sacrifice that involved 6 men who first raped the slave girl before she was killed. Then, while 2 men held her hands and 2 others grabbed her wrists, an old woman known as the Angel of Death strangled her with a rope while simultaneously stabbing her between the ribs. The level of coordination required for this execution demonstrates that these weren't spontaneous acts of violence, they were carefully choreographed rituals that everyone understood and accepted. The aftermath was equally systematic. Once the slave was dead, her body would be placed beside her master's corpse, and both would be burned together or buried in elaborate graves. The slave received no individual recognition, no grave goods of her own, no acknowledgement of her humanity. She was treated exactly like any other piece of property valuable enough to sacrifice, but not important enough to commemorate. What makes this even more disturbing is how the Vikings justified these practices. They weren't seen as murders but as religious obligations. The slaves weren't victims but offerings. This wasn't cruelty but devotion. The mental gymnastics required to transform systematic killing into spiritual duty reveals how deeply societies can rationalize even the most horrific behaviors when they serve the interests of those in power. The archaeological record shows that slave sacrifice wasn't limited to major chieftains or kings. Wealthy merchants, successful raiders, and other members of the Viking elite also took slaves with them to the grave. Some burial sites contain multiple sacrificed individuals, suggesting that really powerful figures required entire retinues in the afterlife. Death wasn't an equalizer in Viking society, it was another opportunity to display wealth and status. The iron restraints found at Viking trading centers tell their own story of suffering. These weren't simple rope bindings, but sophisticated metal devices designed for long-term control. They included neck collars that could be locked in place, ankle shackles that prevented escape, and wrist restraints that made resistance impossible. The craftsmanship involved in making these devices shows that slave control was a specialized industry with its own tools and techniques. But here's what's really haunting. The Vikings didn't see themselves as monsters. They viewed slave sacrifice as a normal part of their religious and social obligations. To them, killing a slave for a burial was no different from burning incense or offering food to the gods. They had so completely dehumanized their victims that murder became mundane, cruelty became ceremony, and genocide became worship. The evidence suggests that these practices continued well into the 11th century, only gradually declining as Christianity spread through Scandinavia. But even then, the change was slow and incomplete. Some regions maintained slave sacrifice long after officially converting to Christianity, creating hybrid burial practices that combined Christian symbols with traditional human offerings. What we're looking at isn't just ancient history, It's a window into how ordinary people can participate in extraordinary evil when their society tells them it's normal, necessary, or even noble. The Vikings who attended these sacrifices weren't psychopaths or sadists. They were farmers, merchants, warriors, and craftsmen who had been taught that some human lives simply didn't matter. The slave boys and girls who died in these ceremonies had names, families, dreams, and fears that we'll never know. They loved and hoped and suffered just like any human being, but their society had declared them non-human, which made their deaths not just possible but inevitable. And that's the most terrifying lesson of all. How quickly and completely a culture can decide that certain people aren't really people at all. The transformation of human beings into property didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process that required generations of cultural conditioning to normalize the unthinkable. By the 11th century, Viking society had perfected a system of dehumanization so complete that children grew up viewing slavery as natural as sunrise or rainfall. They learned to sort people into categories from birth, free, slave, and everything in between. What's particularly disturbing is how this mindset infected every aspect of daily life. Slave children weren't just workers, they were training tools for free children to practice dominance. Young Viking boys learned to command and control human beings the same way they learned to use weapons or sailboats. Cruelty wasn't just permitted, it was educational. The archaeological evidence shows wear patterns on restraints that suggest they were sized for children, meaning even the youngest slaves were kept in chains. The breeding programs were perhaps the most systematic aspect of this horror. Vikings didn't just capture slaves, they manufactured them. Female slaves were forced to reproduce, creating new generations of property that never knew freedom. The children born from these arrangements had no legal identity, no family names, no inheritance except bondage. They were literally bred like livestock, with careful attention paid to producing workers with desirable traits. Genetic analysis of burial sites reveals something even more chilling. Some of the sacrificed slaves were children of their masters. DNA testing shows familial relationships between the buried free men and the decapitated slaves found beside them. We're looking at fathers who killed their own children because their mothers were slaves. The legal system was so twisted that paternal blood meant nothing if maternal slavery tainted it. The preparation rituals for these sacrifices reveal psychological torture that modern interrogators would recognize. The selected slaves weren't just killed, they were broken first. Ibn Fadlan's account describes how the chosen girl was given constant attention, never left alone, fed alcohol continuously, and encouraged to celebrate her upcoming death. This wasn't kindness. It was systematic mental destruction designed to ensure compliance. The alcohol served a specific purpose beyond simple intoxication. Archaeological analysis of preserved stomach contents from sacrificed slaves shows extremely high levels of alcohol consumption in their final days. They were kept drunk enough to be manageable but sober enough to participate in the ceremony. The Vikings had figured out the exact amount of intoxication needed to maintain control while preserving the religious significance of willing sacrifice. But the most horrifying aspect was the sexual component of these rituals. The rape that preceded murder wasn't random violence, it was ceremonial requirement. Multiple sources describe how the slave girl was forced to have intercourse with several men before being killed, often including relatives of the deceased chieftain. This wasn't about gratification, it was about spiritual contamination. They believed the sexual acts would bind the slave's spirit to her master's family, ensuring her loyalty in the afterlife. The logistics of these ceremonies required extensive planning and community coordination. Village records from the period show detailed preparations for major burial sacrifices, including assignments for who would perform which roles, schedules for the multi-day ceremonies, and even meal planning for the crowds that gathered to watch. Death had become entertainment, and murder had become a community festival. The economic calculations behind slave sacrifice reveal how completely human beings had been reduced to numbers. Historical records show that a healthy young slave represented roughly 2 years of a farmer's income. Sacrificing multiple slaves for a single burial was equivalent to burning a fortune, which is exactly why it impressed people. The waste wasn't accidental, it was the entire point. Only someone with tremendous wealth could afford to destroy valuable property for religious purposes. The regional variations in sacrifice methods show how different Viking communities developed their own specialized techniques for killing. Norwegian sites show evidence of strangulation combined with stabbing, Swedish graves reveal drowning followed by decapitation, and Danish burials indicate crushing injuries that suggest being buried alive. Each region had perfected its own signature style of ceremonial murder. The timing of these sacrifices was also carefully calculated for maximum psychological impact. Many weren't performed immediately after the master's death, but were delayed for weeks or months while elaborate preparations were made. The condemned slaves lived in a state of suspended execution, knowing their fate but not knowing when it would arrive. This prolonged terror served multiple purposes. It gave time for proper ceremony planning. It demonstrated the master's continued power over life and death, even after his own death, and it provided ongoing entertainment for the community. Archaeological evidence from workshop sites shows that specialized tools were developed specifically for slave sacrifice. These weren't standard weapons or farming implements, but purpose-built devices designed for ceremonial killing. They included strangulation cords made from specially treated leather, daggers with ritual markings, and restraint systems that could be quickly applied during the sacrifice ceremony. The craftsmanship involved in making these tools shows that slave killing had become its own specialized profession. The disposal of bodies after sacrifice reveals another layer of dehumanization. While masters were carefully positioned in their graves with valuable possessions, sacrificed slaves were often tossed in carelessly, sometimes landing in positions that suggest they were thrown rather than placed. Some were buried incomplete, with body parts scattered or missing entirely. Even in death, their humanity was denied through careless treatment of their remains. The social pressure to participate in these rituals was enormous. Community members who refused to attend sacrifices or who showed sympathy for the victims faced social ostracism and economic consequences. There are records of people being excluded from trade relationships, denied marriage partners for their children, and even exiled from communities for failing to properly support sacrifice ceremonies. Compassion became a luxury that few could afford. The international nature of the Viking slave trade meant that sacrifice victims came from across the known world. Isotope analysis reveals slaves from Ireland, Scotland, England, Eastern Europe, and even North Africa being killed in Scandinavian burial ceremonies. These people had been kidnapped from their homes, transported hundreds or thousands of miles, sold in foreign markets, and then murdered in religious ceremonies conducted in languages they didn't understand for gods they had never worshipped. The record-keeping systems that developed around slavery show how bureaucratic evil could become. Some sites have preserved tally marks carved into wood or stone that tracked slave inventories, including separate counts for those designated for sacrifice. There were accounting systems that treated human deaths as business expenses and spiritual investments. Murder had become a line item in religious budgets. The training programs for sacrifice participants reveal how systematically violence was institutionalized. Young men weren't just expected to participate in killings, they were taught proper techniques through formal instruction. There were apprenticeships in ceremonial murder, with experienced killers passing down specialized knowledge to the next generation. Violence wasn't just normalized, it was professionalized. The psychological profiles of frequent sacrifice participants, reconstructed from burial goods and historical records, show how repeated killing affected the killers themselves. Many developed elaborate personal rituals around their participation, collected trophies from their victims, and competed with each other over their killing techniques. What started as religious obligation often evolved into personal obsession. The resistance movements that occasionally emerged among slave populations were brutally suppressed, with methods designed to terrorize potential rebels. Archaeological evidence shows examples of slaves who were tortured before being killed, with their bodies displayed publicly as warnings to others. The message was clear. Attempted escape or rebellion wouldn't just result in death, it would result in prolonged suffering that made sacrifice look merciful by comparison. The corruption of children in this system represents perhaps its most evil aspect. Free children grew up attending sacrifice ceremonies, learning to view human killing as normal entertainment. They played games that mimicked the sacrifice rituals, practiced on small animals, and competed to see who could show the least emotion while watching people die. Entire generations were psychologically damaged by this normalization of murder. The economic incentives that sustained this system created a feedback loop of increasing brutality. The slave trade generated enormous profits that funded more raids, which captured more slaves, which enabled larger sacrifices, which demonstrated greater wealth and power, which attracted more followers and trading partners. Success bred more success, and each success required more human suffering to maintain. The technological innovations developed specifically for slave control and sacrifice show how human ingenuity can be perverted toward evil ends. These included improved shackle designs that prevented escape without causing death, drugs that induced compliance without complete unconsciousness, and killing techniques that maximized ceremonial impact while minimizing damage to the corpse. Intelligence was applied to suffering with the same creativity used for legitimate innovations. The international diplomatic consequences of these practices were carefully managed through a system of willful ignorance and cultural relativism. Foreign traders and diplomats learned to avoid asking questions about the source of goods or the fate of missing persons. Everyone understood that profitable relationships required overlooking inconvenient moral questions. Commerce demanded ethical blindness. The seasonal patterns of sacrifice ceremonies reveal how these killings were integrated into the agricultural and social calendar. Major sacrifices were timed to coincide with harvests, religious festivals, and trading seasons. Death had become just another seasonal activity, as predictable and necessary as planting crops or repairing boats. The rhythm of life included the rhythm of murder. The preservation of sacrifice victims' personal belongings provides heartbreaking glimpses into their humanity. Archaeologists have found small personal items buried with slaves, simple jewelry, carved trinkets, religious symbols from their original cultures. These people maintained their identities and connections to their lost homes even while being prepared for death. They remained human despite every effort to reduce them to property. The documentation systems that tracked sacrifice ceremonies show how thoroughly bureaucratized murder had become. There were official records of who was killed when, detailed inventories of sacrifice equipment, and even performance evaluations of ceremony participants. Death had become administrative routine, with paperwork and procedures that treated human killing as standard business practice. The legal frameworks that supported these practices reveal how thoroughly law had been weaponized against the powerless. Viking legal codes contain detailed regulations about slave sacrifice, including which types of slaves could be killed for which ranks of masters, proper procedures for selecting victims, and penalties for conducting ceremonies incorrectly. Murder wasn't just legal, it was legally mandated for proper burial rites. Court records from the period show disputes over sacrifice rights that read like property law cases. Families argued over who had the legal authority to kill specific slaves, whether borrowed slaves could be sacrificed by temporary owners, and how to divide sacrifice duties among multiple heirs. Human lives were litigated like inheritance disputes, with judges ruling on who had the stronger claim to commit murder. The taxation systems that developed around slavery included specific assessments for sacrifice obligations. Wealthy individuals paid higher taxes partly because they were expected to provide more elaborate burial ceremonies, including larger numbers of sacrificed slaves. The government literally taxed people based on their anticipated body count, creating financial incentives to kill more people for religious ceremonies. The training facilities for sacrifice ceremonies operated like schools for systematic murder. Archaeological evidence from several sites shows dedicated buildings where community members practiced killing techniques on animals and condemned prisoners. These weren't informal gatherings but structured educational programs with curricula, instructors, and graduated levels of participation. They were teaching murder like a trade skill. The medical knowledge that developed around keeping sacrifice victims alive until the ceremony reveals disturbing expertise in prolonging suffering. Viking healers learned to treat injuries and illnesses in condemned slaves, not to ease their pain but to ensure they survived long enough for proper sacrifice. They developed techniques for maintaining health in people who were destined to die, creating a twisted form of medical ethics that prioritized ceremony over compassion. The breeding records kept by major slave owners show how human reproduction was managed like livestock production. These documents tracked bloodlines, noted desirable traits in offspring, and planned strategic breeding to produce slaves with specific characteristics. Children were conceived not from love or even lust, but from calculated decisions about genetic engineering for slavery purposes. The transportation networks that moved slaves across Viking territories operated with industrial efficiency. There were established routes, regular schedules, and specialized vessels designed for human cargo transport. Way stations provided temporary holding facilities where slaves could be fed, rested, and prepared for the next leg of their journey to market or sacrifice. Human trafficking had become a sophisticated logistics operation. The quality control systems applied to sacrifice victims reveal how completely people had been reduced to consumer goods. Slaves designated for important ceremonies underwent inspections to ensure they met standards for health, appearance, and behavior. Those who failed inspection were either killed immediately or downgraded to less prestigious sacrifice ceremonies. Even in death, there were different classes of victims for different classes of masters. The psychological conditioning programs used on young slaves show how systematically free will was destroyed from childhood. Children born into slavery were subjected to training regimens designed to break their spirits and create perfect compliance. They were taught that their only value came from serving others, that resistance was both futile and morally wrong, and that their eventual sacrifice would be the highest honor they could achieve. The religious justifications developed for these practices show how theology could be twisted to sanctify evil. Viking priests created elaborate mythological frameworks that portrayed slave sacrifice as necessary for cosmic balance, divine favor, and spiritual prosperity. They taught that gods demanded human blood, that masters needed servants in the afterlife, and that slaves achieved salvation through death. Murder became a sacrament, and killers became priests. The artistic representations of sacrifice ceremonies found in carvings, metalwork, and textiles reveal how normalized these killings had become in popular culture. Artists depicted sacrifice scenes with the same casual treatment given to farming, trading, or hunting activities. Murder had become so routine that it appeared in decorative art alongside everyday life scenes, suggesting that killing people was as unremarkable as feeding livestock. The competitive aspects that developed around sacrifice ceremonies turned murder into sport. Wealthy Vikings competed to stage the most elaborate killings, with innovations in ceremony design, victim preparation, and execution techniques. They kept score of how many people they'd killed, compared their methods with other killers, and sought recognition for their creativity in developing new forms of ceremonial murder. The apprenticeship programs that trained future sacrifice leaders reveal how knowledge of systematic killing was formally transmitted across generations. Master killers took on students who learned not just the physical techniques of murder, but the psychological manipulation, ceremony organization, and victim management required for successful sacrifices. There were graduation ceremonies where students demonstrated their killing skills on live victims. The international trade relationships that developed around sacrifice equipment show how murder had become a commercial enterprise. Viking merchants specialized in importing and exporting tools designed specifically for human sacrifice, including restraints from Eastern Europe, drugs from Mediterranean sources, and ceremonial weapons from across the known world. Death had become a global market opportunity. The insurance systems that protected slave owners against premature death of sacrifice victims reveal how thoroughly human lives had been financialized. Owners could purchase coverage that compensated them if designated sacrifice slaves died before ceremonies, ensuring that their spiritual investments were protected against unexpected losses. Companies calculated actuarial tables based on slave mortality rates and ceremony timing. The entertainment value that sacrifice ceremonies provided for communities shows how murder had become recreational activity. People traveled long distances to attend famous sacrifices, paid fees for premium viewing positions, and brought food and drink to enjoy during the killings. Children were given days off from work to attend ceremonies, and families made sacrifices into holiday outings complete with picnics and games. The diplomatic protocols that governed international attendance at sacrifice ceremonies reveal how murder had become a form of statecraft. Foreign dignitaries were invited to witness important killings as demonstrations of power and wealth. Attendance at sacrifice ceremonies became part of treaty negotiations, trade agreements, and military alliances. Countries. The record-keeping systems that tracked individuals competed to stage the most impressive murders for international audiences. Slaves throughout their lives show how completely human beings had been reduced to inventory items. Each slave received identification marks, had their skills and health status regularly updated, and carried documentation of their ownership history. Their entire existence was catalogued and monitored like any other valuable commodity that might eventually be consumed. The seasonal migration patterns that moved slaves between different types of work reveal how their lives were organized around maximizing their eventual sacrifice value. Slaves were rotated between agricultural labor, household service, and ceremonial preparation based on calendar needs and market demands. Their daily existence was planned around their eventual death, with every activity designed to increase their value as sacrifice victims. The educational curricula that taught free children about slavery included formal instruction in sacrifice ceremonies and victim selection. Children learned to evaluate slaves for sacrifice suitability, understand the religious significance of different killing methods, and appreciate the social status implications of elaborate ceremonies. Murder was literally part of their elementary education, taught alongside reading and arithmetic. The technological innovations that improved sacrifice efficiency show how human creativity was applied to perfecting murder. These included restraint systems that could handle multiple victims simultaneously, killing techniques that maximized ceremonial impact while minimizing cleanup, and preservation methods that kept corpses presentable for extended ceremonies. Engineering talent was devoted to optimizing human slaughter. The quality assurance programs that evaluated sacrifice ceremonies reveal how murder had become subject to performance standards. There were official reviewers who assessed ceremony execution, victim preparation, and audience engagement. Sacrifice leaders received feedback on their technique and recommendations for improvement. Killing people had become a profession with measurable performance metrics and career advancement opportunities. The supply chain management systems that coordinated slave acquisition, preparation, and sacrifice show industrial-level organization of human trafficking. There were procurement specialists who identified and captured suitable victims, logistics coordinators who managed transportation and storage, and ceremony planners who scheduled optimal timing for maximum impact. Every aspect of turning free people into dead sacrifices was systematically organized and professionally managed. The cultural export programs that spread Viking sacrifice practices to other societies reveal how evil ideas can be transmitted across civilizations. Viking traders, raiders, and settlers introduced sacrifice ceremonies to communities that had never practiced human killing, teaching local leaders how to implement their own programs. Murder became a cultural export, spreading Viking brutality far beyond Scandinavian borders through a combination of example, instruction, and intimidation. The contamination of other cultures through Viking influence created a domino effect of brutality that spread across medieval Europe like a plague. When Viking settlers established communities in Ireland, England, and France, they brought their sacrifice traditions with them, adapting local customs to include human killing. Archaeological evidence from Dublin shows Irish burial sites that suddenly began including decapitated slaves around 850 CE, exactly when Viking influence peaked in the region. What's particularly disturbing is how quickly local populations adopted these practices. Within a single generation, communities that had never practiced human sacrifice were staging elaborate killing ceremonies that rivaled anything seen in Scandinavia. The Vikings hadn't just conquered territory, they had conquered minds, convincing entire societies that murder was not just acceptable but spiritually necessary. The adaptation process reveals how cultural contamination works on a psychological level. Local leaders didn't simply copy Viking ceremonies exactly, they modified them to fit their own religious beliefs and social structures. Irish chieftains began sacrificing slaves to Celtic gods. English nobles incorporated human killing into Christian burial rites, and French aristocrats developed hybrid ceremonies that combined local traditions with imported brutality. This cultural fusion created new forms of evil that were often worse than the original Viking practices. When different traditions of violence merged, they produced innovative cruelties that neither culture had previously imagined. Archaeological sites from this period show evidence of killing techniques that don't match any single cultural pattern, suggesting that communities were experimenting with different methods and developing their own signature styles of murder. The speed of this cultural transmission was accelerated by the Viking practice of intermarriage with local elites. When Viking warriors married into prominent local families, their wives and children were expected to participate in sacrifice ceremonies. These mixed families became bridges between cultures, translating Viking brutality into local contexts and making murder feel familiar rather than foreign. The economic incentives that drove this cultural spread were enormous. Communities that adopted Viking sacrifice practices gained access to lucrative trade networks and military alliances that were closed to those who refused to participate. Moral resistance became economically unsustainable when neighboring communities were profiting from their willingness to embrace systematic murder. The religious leaders who initially opposed these practices were systematically corrupted through a combination of bribes, threats, and theological manipulation. Viking settlers worked closely with local priests and druids to develop religious justifications for human sacrifice that sounded consistent with existing beliefs. They didn't replace local religions, they infected them with murderous interpretations that made killing feel like worship. The children who grew up in these hybrid communities represent perhaps the most tragic casualties of cultural contamination. They learn to view human sacrifice as a normal part of religious life, inheriting both their parents' original traditions and the imported Viking brutality. These children couldn't distinguish between authentic cultural practices and foreign corruption because they had never known anything different. The documentation systems that tracked this cultural spread show how deliberately the Vikings promoted their sacrifice practices in conquered territories. They established schools for local elites that included instruction in proper ceremony techniques, provided financial support for communities that staged impressive sacrifices, and created competitive festivals where different regions could display their killing skills. The resistance movements that occasionally emerged were brutally suppressed through coordinated campaigns that involved both Viking settlers and their local collaborators. Communities that refused to adopt sacrifice practices faced economic boycotts, military raids, and social isolation that made survival nearly impossible. The message was clear: embrace murder or face extinction. The psychological warfare techniques used to break down resistance reveal sophisticated understanding of how to manipulate human behavior. The Vikings didn't simply force people to participate in sacrifices, they created situations where participation felt like the only rational choice. They staged demonstrations of power that showed the consequences of resistance, offered rewards that made collaboration attractive, and created social pressures that made non-participation feel like betrayal of community interests. The legal frameworks that formalized these imported practices show how quickly murder could become institutionalized in societies that had previously rejected human sacrifice. Local courts began hearing cases related to sacrifice obligations, property rights in slaves, and ceremonial procedures. Legal scholars developed expertise in sacrifice law, creating professional careers around the administration of systematic murder. The architectural innovations that accommodated sacrifice ceremonies reveal how physical spaces were modified to support imported brutality. Archaeological evidence shows existing religious sites being rebuilt with features designed for human killing, including drainage systems for blood disposal, viewing areas for audiences, and specialized storage spaces for ceremony equipment. Sacred spaces were literally reconstructed around the requirements of murder. The medical expertise that developed around sacrifice ceremonies shows how professional knowledge was adapted to serve evil purposes. Local healers learned Viking techniques for keeping victims alive during extended torture, preserving corpses for prolonged ceremonies, and treating injuries sustained by ceremony participants. Medical skills that should have been used for healing were perverted into tools for maximizing suffering. The artistic traditions that incorporated sacrifice imagery reveal how deeply these practices penetrated local cultures. Craftsmen began creating artwork that depicted human killing alongside traditional cultural symbols, suggesting that murder had become integrated into fundamental identity concepts. The aesthetic celebration of violence shows how completely communities had embraced imported brutality as part of their authentic heritage. The trade relationships that developed around sacrifice equipment created international networks dedicated to supporting systematic murder. Local craftsmen learned to produce Viking-style restraints, weapons, and ceremony tools, while merchants specialized in importing exotic materials needed for elaborate sacrifices. Entire economic sectors emerged to serve the growing demand for murder supplies. The diplomatic consequences of adopting sacrifice practices extended far beyond individual communities. Regions that embraced human killing found themselves excluded from certain trade relationships and military alliances, while simultaneously gaining access to others. The international political landscape reorganized around attitudes towards systematic murder, creating new forms of cooperation and conflict. The seasonal calendar modifications that incorporated sacrifice ceremonies show how imported practices were integrated into existing cultural rhythms. Communities added new holidays dedicated to human killing, timed sacrifices to coincide with traditional festivals, and created ceremonial cycles that blended local customs with Viking brutality. The calendar itself became a weapon for normalizing murder. The educational systems that taught sacrifice techniques to local populations reveal how knowledge of systematic killing was deliberately spread. Viking settlers established training programs that taught proper ceremony procedures, victim selection criteria, and killing techniques to local leaders. These educational initiatives created cadres of trained killers who could maintain sacrifice traditions even after Viking influence waned. The competitive frameworks that emerged between different communities show how murder became a form of cultural expression and regional pride. Towns competed to stage the most elaborate sacrifices, developed signature killing techniques that became associated with local identity, and created festivals where different regions could demonstrate their sacrifice capabilities. Murder became a source of community pride and cultural distinction. The inheritance systems that passed sacrifice obligations between generations reveal how temporary cultural contamination became permanent institutional practice. Communities developed legal frameworks that required heirs to maintain sacrifice traditions, created financial mechanisms that funded ongoing ceremony costs, and established social expectations that made abandoning murder feel like betraying ancestral heritage. The integration processes that merged sacrifice practices with existing religious traditions show how evil ideas can disguise themselves as spiritual development. Local religious leaders learned to present human killing as the natural evolution of their faith traditions, arguing that sacrifice represented deeper understanding of divine will rather than foreign corruption. Murder was rebranded as theological sophistication. The surveillance systems that monitored compliance with sacrifice obligations reveal how communities policed their own participation in systematic murder. Neighbors reported families who seemed reluctant to participate in ceremonies. Local officials tracked attendance at sacrifices, and social networks created informal pressure systems that made non-participation virtually impossible. Communities became accomplices in monitoring their own corruption. The punishment systems that enforced sacrifice participation show how resistance was systematically eliminated. Communities developed penalties for refusing ceremony attendance, created social consequences for expressing sympathy toward victims, and established legal frameworks that made opposition to human killing a criminal offense. Compassion became illegal, and murder became mandatory. The recruitment systems that identified potential sacrifice participants reveal how communities organized their own participation in evil. Local leaders developed criteria for selecting ceremony roles, created training programs for different types of participation, and established advancement systems that rewarded enthusiastic involvement in systematic murder. Killing people became a pathway to social advancement and community recognition. The documentation systems that recorded local sacrifice activities show how communities tracked their own descent into systematic evil. Towns kept detailed records of ceremonies performed, victims sacrificed, and community participation rates. These documents reveal how murder became routine bureaucratic activity, with paperwork and procedures that treated human killing as standard administrative function. The celebration systems that honored successful sacrifice participants reveal how communities rewarded involvement in systematic murder. There were awards for exceptional ceremony performance, recognition systems for innovative killing techniques, and social honors for families that contributed multiple victims. Murder became a source of public acclaim and community celebration. The standardization processes that created consistent sacrifice procedures across different regions show how imported evil became systematized and institutionalized. Communities developed shared protocols for ceremony organization, victim preparation, and killing techniques. Local variations were gradually eliminated in favor of standardized procedures that maximized efficiency and consistency in human slaughter. The financing systems that funded ongoing sacrifice activities reveal how communities invested in their own participation in systematic murder. Towns created special tax assessments to support ceremony costs, established savings programs to fund elaborate sacrifices, and developed investment strategies that generated ongoing revenue for human killing activities. Murder became a budget line item that communities planned and funded like any other municipal service. The quality control systems that evaluated sacrifice ceremonies show how murder became subject to professional standards and performance metrics. Communities established review processes for ceremony execution, created feedback mechanisms for improving killing techniques, and developed certification programs for sacrifice leaders. Human slaughter was professionalized with the same attention to excellence applied to legitimate trades and crafts. The expansion strategies that spread sacrifice practices to new regions reveal how systematically communities worked to contaminate their neighbors. Successful sacrifice communities sent missionaries to teach killing techniques, provided financial support for new ceremony programs, and created incentive systems that encouraged adoption of human sacrifice. Murder became evangelical, with communities actively promoting systematic killing as a positive development. The maintenance systems that sustained sacrifice practices over time show how imported evil became self-perpetuating cultural tradition. Communities developed institutional mechanisms that preserved sacrifice knowledge across generations, created social structures that maintained ceremony capabilities, and established cultural narratives that justified ongoing human killing. Murder became traditional heritage that communities felt obligated to preserve and pass down to future generations. The preservation of these murderous traditions required constant reinforcement through storytelling and cultural mythology. Communities developed elaborate narratives that portrayed their ancestors as heroes for embracing sacrifice practices, creating legends that celebrated famous killers and memorable ceremonies. Children grew up hearing bedtime stories about brave warriors who died surrounded by their faithful slaves, with the murders reframed as touching displays of loyalty and devotion. These cultural narratives served a crucial psychological function. They transformed historical atrocities into foundational myths that defined community identity. Towns competed to claim the most impressive sacrifice heritage, exaggerating the scale and sophistication of their ceremonial murders. What had started as imported Viking brutality became source material for local pride and cultural superiority claims. The storytelling techniques used to romanticize these practices reveal sophisticated propaganda methods that would be familiar to modern audiences. Community elders learned to emphasize the voluntary nature of slave participation while minimizing details about coercion and violence. They focused on the honor received by sacrifice victims while glossing over their terror and suffering. The narrative framing made systematic murder sound like mutual benefit rather than exploitation. The seasonal storytelling cycles that reinforced sacrifice traditions show how communities used regular cultural events to maintain enthusiasm for human killing. Winter gatherings featured stories about legendary sacrifices, spring festivals included reenactments of famous ceremonies, and harvest celebrations incorporated sacrifice themes into traditional entertainment. Murder became woven into the cultural calendar as thoroughly as agricultural activities or religious observances. The competitive storytelling traditions that emerged between communities reveal how murder became a source of regional identity and cultural competition. Towns developed signature sacrifice legends that distinguished them from neighboring communities, created storytelling contests where different regions could showcase their most impressive killing narratives, and established cultural festivals that celebrated their unique contributions to systematic slaughter. The educational storytelling programs that taught children about sacrifice traditions show how communities ensured generational transmission of murderous values. Schools included sacrifice stories in their regular curricula. Parents were expected to share family killing traditions with their children, and community leaders organized special storytelling events designed to inspire young people to participate in future ceremonies. The religious storytelling frameworks that justified ongoing sacrifice practices reveal how communities integrated murder into their spiritual belief systems. Local priests developed sermon cycles that included sacrifice themes, created prayer traditions that honored murdered slaves, and established religious narratives that portrayed human killing as divine service. Sacred storytelling became a vehicle for sanctifying systematic evil. This is the reality of Viking Age burial practices that history books often sanitize and Hollywood completely ignores. We've uncovered a systematic program of human sacrifice that makes modern atrocities look amateurish by comparison. These weren't isolated incidents or desperate acts during wartime. This was organized, institutionalized murder that entire communities celebrated as spiritual necessity. The archaeological evidence, eyewitness accounts, and forensic analysis all point to the same terrifying conclusion. The Vikings had turned killing people into an art form, complete with specialized tools, professional training, and international trade networks. What makes this even more disturbing is how quickly and completely this brutality spread to other cultures, proving that evil ideas are just as contagious as deadly diseases. The next time someone romanticizes Viking culture or talks about the good old days, remember the slave boys and girls whose screams were drowned out by drum beats while entire communities watched their murders as entertainment. Because the most frightening lesson from all of this isn't what humans are capable of doing to each other. It's how easily we can convince ourselves that monstrous behavior is not just acceptable, but noble.